Thank you for coming back to our second session. I hope everybody had a nice lunch. To kick it off, first, we'd like to invite Dina Ringgold and Yue Li from the World Bank team to talk about this next panel. Dina?
Hello. So I'm Dina Ringgold, and I'm a member of the core team for the report. And over lunch, we were talking about the experience of being on the team, and what, for me, one of the best things was just the chance to be with a great group of people and all of the discussions that we had in conference rooms and with great minds all over the world. And this session today is making me very nostalgic for those days, because we're sort of going over some of the issues that we struggled with quite a bit, and it's great to get your insights and new ideas. So this session is about jobs are transformational, where we look in depth, as Martin said this morning, into the relationship of jobs, living standards, productivity, and social cohesion. And just a couple of things which have come up already, but just to highlight, which we see as contributions to the report. For living standards, going beyond earnings and wages and getting into the literature. We found a really interesting body of literature on mental health and jobs, literature on life satisfaction. We go into these issues on worker safety and health, which we find very important. Social cohesion, when we started, this was really a wide open area. There's not much that directly links the ideas that we were getting at of how societies function, how societies manage tensions and ethnic diversity through jobs and what the role of jobs is. So we did some exploratory work, as Martin said, with the value surveys, with the World Value Surveys and some of the barometer surveys. Also some work on causality as well as correlations, looking at these variables of civic engagement and trust. But those were just two of things that, as Susan said, that we had to measure, had available to us. But perhaps in the discussion we could think through other ways in which we could think about measuring those relationships. In the survey that Martin showed with the doctors and the teachers and the civil servants, we also asked people about the ways in which jobs have these social benefits for identity, for networks, connecting them, and for fairness. And people do report that these are important dimensions of their jobs. So perhaps there are ways in which we could get at those. On fairness, the work that we did on inequality of opportunities and trying to measure how much of access to a job is due to circumstances at birth beyond an individual's control, such as gender and location and ethnicity, versus those that are more related to effort and experience. I think that was a new area where I think further work is being done inside the bank, and it would be interesting to discuss what the implications are for thinking about the link between jobs and fairness. So, Yue, do you want to say something about productivity?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yue Li, the youngest member of the team. First, I want to thank the organizers and, especially Ravi and Yan for this opportunity. I want to say loudly that it makes me confirm that this is one of the best jobs I could ever have in my life. Basically, I won't have the concern that I need to resign from the bank because I just joined. And in addition, we started stimulating discussion like this in Berlin last year, almost exactly last year. And some of you are there helping us to jumpstart. And after 1 year struggle, now we resumed. And nothing could be more rewarding and satisfactory that to reassure to ourselves that we asked some relevant questions and presented our perspective, and now we are ready to listen to your perspectives on various issues. Okay, so to turn back to productivity and jobs. I think now Martin is not officially my boss, so I can also speak out what come off my mind. One thing I realized throughout the process is what we did. One innovative thing I found is we state the obvious, like loudly. One thing is about jobs and productivity. What we say is jobs is what we do. That nothing could be more obvious than that. And individually, each job is, as Susan mentioned, it's a connector of all the factors of production: labor, capital, land, everything. And collectively, all the jobs, lead to the output, the GDP, the growth. And maybe, increase in productivity was, ultimately driven by innovation, by new ideas, new machine, new capital. People become better at managing other people. But it happens through jobs, happens through this process, happens through people get better at what they do, happens through less productive ones were destroyed and the most productive ones are created. So this process itself gets own life. That's what I realized through studying this all year. And we didn't add much on that aspect. We just look over others' data and show that across different countries, between 7 to 20% of jobs are created each year. But at the same time, similar amount of jobs also destroyed. And then following that observation, there could be many directions to go, as Yang mentioned. Maybe we could look at whether it's jobs or whether it's workers, where those workers go. The direction we take in one chapter is look at, where this process take place in terms what type of firms it take place. We try to, tackle the issue of data in this aspect, because the formal surveys generally look at, the formal firms or larger firms in our perspectives. So we use actually household survey data and using one of the questions and to recalculate. Estimate, should be more accurate, estimate what are the share of micro enterprise, those employ less than 10 employees in the total distribution. What we found is in countries like Ethiopia, as late as 1999, there are 97% of employment actually happens in micro enterprise. Similarly, more striking is in Chile, a high middle income country, about like 40% of employment in manufacture is actually taking place in micro enterprises. So then we look closer at some of those micro enterprise or the distribute whole spectrum of firms, see their dynamics. What we found is that in contrast to some of the more advanced or industrial countries, many of those firms just churning, lack of dynamics. One comparison we made, we look at is between Mexico, India, and the US. After 35 years of growth, firms could, on average, become 10 times larger in the US. But what happened in India is they actually declined in terms of average size. And in Mexico, it's only increased by 2 times. So those are the main, so-called innovations we found. Some of them are obvious. And now let's discuss.
Thank you. I too have to comment on the genius of the title of this report. One word, jobs. It says so little, and yet it says pretty much everything. The multidimensional nature of jobs, whether we're talking about values, lifestyle, economics, public policy, it really does cross so many disciplines. And I'm so happy to be part of this panel because we have a great mix of social scientists. To my left is Saskia Sassen, a sociologist here at Columbia. To her left, from the Humphrey School at University of Minnesota, is Ragui Assaad. We've got Saul Estrin from London School of Economics. To his left, and on the end, another colleague from Columbia, Bentley MacLeod. Saskia, you have the first mic.
Okay, very good.
Slides.
Yes, I want to see a book called Jobs. No subtitle, nothing, just jobs. It just captures. But it also indicates, when you think of labor, what a complex category that is, how the enormous measurement problems, if you take a global perspective, we are talking about probably 1 billion workers who are not being counted in terms of your typical measurements. We have unpaid workers in households. I just see Joanne Vanek here from WIGO, who has spent a lot of time trying to measure that. So we know that it is a complex category. Now, one question I was asked to address, and I can address it only partly, is the role of jobs in constituting, if you want, social cohesion. And I think when you ask that question, you immediately run into the mutability of the role of jobs. And I have this very nice chart that is, even if you don't, even if you can see the numbers, I just want the curve. The curve is interesting. And I would say that in this period here, the adorable Keynesian decades, 1942 to into the 1980s, 1987, probably at that point, if you just, this is salary, this is earners, but the shape of this curve, I'll elaborate a bit more, indicates one moment where actually labor markets, the access to job, the way labor markets worked for social cohesion. You have the growth of this is the United States. You have a prosperous working class, you have a growing middle class. But if you look, this is 100 years, right, from 1917 to, in fact, it goes on till the current census. You see that the top 10% of salary earners, we're not talking capital gains, we're just talking what, in other words, an indicator of something, received, grabbed, you can choose your word here, 47% of all the salaries. So it's a question of not household income, but salaries. Then it goes down to 33%. That is still a very robust share, clearly. But it enables, this doesn't show it, but it implies it, it enables the growth of other sectors. And I would say that here, in these decades, jobs constituted a kind of social tissue that was good. There were ladders for promotions, etc. And then in 1987, you know, when the new global era begins, with its goods and its bad things, so you have this very, very sharp increase. Now, if you, this is another measure, and again, goes up to the 2009 census data here. But here I want to touch on something that has to do with the difficulty of seeing, of measuring. What is it that our measures, or for that matter, our laws, make visible, and what do they make invisible? So here are two stories in this graph. And it's, and again, it's this is 79 census. It is the percentage growth in after-tax income. And again, we're talking salaries. We're not talking capital gains and other sources of income, 1979 to 2007. And you see that the top 1% grows almost 300% if you pull it through. What I'm interested in is the bottom 40%. The bottom 40% hardly saw an increase in their income. Now, these are very aggregate figures, certainly. However, if you read the literature of this whole period, it is centered very much on the gentrification process, new buildings, new airports. You have a visual space that suggests extraordinary prosperity for everybody. So there is a real problem. It might be the geographies of many labor markets or where the jobs are, of rendering invisible, even in that visual material sense, the kind of lack of growth and lack of prosperity. Now, here I want to get into another issue. And here, I didn't know you were going to be here, Joan, okay? So here are gender ratios. And I want to touch here on things that are, again, the unexpected, where if you look at a lot of the general trends, you miss it. So here, worth pointing out, now this is OECD. I should, of course, have used your report, but these were the slides that I had. So these are women workers. And these are the countries, these are OECD. And you see native ratios versus immigrant. And you see that immigrant women have fairly high ratios, as do native women, by the way. And then the other, I can barely see this. And the second one is women and men, natives and immigrants. And these are more OECD countries. So next slide here are the gender ratios of natives and immigrants. And you see that in non-OECD countries, you have enormous variability in the participation of women. So again, if we wanted to get at the heart of some of these matters, you really need to take a global perspective because there is enormous variability. Now, these numbers are very small, but in fact, they are very significant transformations. And here is a question of female unemployment in OECD countries. And look at foreign women. in other words, immigrant women, but also professional women, they are pretty similar here. If you take, again, I'm not assuming that everybody can read all the data. These are just sort of patterns, if you want. Now, if you take the next slide, you see non-OECD countries, and you get sort of not that unsimilar a picture, though there are differences, clearly the case. Now, this is, did I just show this? Yes, right. This is now I want to touch on a totally different issue, and I want to stick a bit with immigrants because those are very often difficult labor markets and workers to measure. And I want to argue that to begin to understand what it means to be a worker, and now here I'm focusing on immigrant workers because they make visible something that if you look at the native population, you don't see. So I look at the spaces, the immigration spaces, and two comments I want to make. One is the enormous variability. It also includes professional workers. But the second point is that immigrants who may arrive and wind up in a low-wage job, that might be a point in a trajectory. And they may, in fact, work their way into much better jobs. For natives, that is often far more difficult. So if you are if you are a minoritized worker in a sort of a ghetto area, you don't have that option. And there is a lot of literature, and it's a controversial literature, certainly. So again, when we are talking jobs, when we're talking labor markets, when we're talking labor, we are dealing with so many variables that I think it is very, very difficult to generalize, including on the productivity question. Now here is a way of constructing, if you want, an immigrant subject. So it could be the low-wage worker, it could be the international businessman or woman, the foreign professional. The IMF citizen is, I'm not going to elaborate, but it is a highly protected. Basically, anybody who is a member of an international institution or comes, or the firm hires workers through WTO, through the treaty law, is a fairly protected worker, is almost like a citizen. You know, they have portable, formal rights. Then you have, these other categories. The point that I'm trying to make is that while the immigrant makes visible this extraordinary variability, when we look at the aggregate data, often we just are concerned with earnings, typically. We miss, I think, a lot of stuff. Now, I want to do make another argument here. And again, it all has to do with the instability, if you want, the conceptual instability of what we call labor, what we call jobs, what we call labor markets. Now here I want to just use, again, using remittances is like a way almost of cheating because it's very simple, it sort of shows its story. But this is something, I'm a sociologist that I run into. So when we say remittances, and I would say some of that also holds if we just use a more generic term like earnings, for instance. So when we say remittances, we're no longer in this current context, in this current period, and using a little word. It's a category. It comes with a vast amount of meaning. And it basically means low-wage workers who go to rich countries and send their money back to their low-wage countries. And there is quite a bit of ideological baggage that can be associated with that. Now, if you take a different perspective, I do this all the time in my research on globalization. So I don't say, where do all the remittances from the United States go to? Mostly poor countries. I ask, and you can do that for every country, right? This radial thing. Here's the country, Germany, and where do these immigrants send their money back? Well, if you just change the question slightly, a slightly conceptual move, and you ask, what are the main remittance recipient countries in the world? You get a very different configuration. You get in the top 10, 5 rich countries, and 1, India, China, that is bimodal. And the United States, and I find this absolutely wonderful, is among the 20 top remittance receiving countries. Now, what are we seeing here? What we're seeing is the new professional classes. So that tells us something else about another global labor market. which is they also send remittances back home. Now, the European countries clearly have a very specific configuration, anybody who is familiar with Europe. But these are ways in which you can actually turn around a very elementary measure, and all this data exists. By the way, I have 204, but I meant to have 206. It's more or less the same distribution, at any rate, before the crisis, because the crisis altered certain. There is one final point that I want to bring in to, again, give a more global perspective. And that is something that goes under the radar screen, I would argue, when we're looking at labor and at jobs and at labor markets. And that is land grabs, as we gently call it. I know that is not a very neutral way of calling it, but you know what I mean. And I just want to give you these figures. So I've been doing a lot of research about this. And if we count, well, there are two things. One is the buying of land by foreign governments or foreign firms is a very old story. I am interested in when an old story, as represented by a curve, suddenly the curve changes direction. So what we see in 206 is the curve of land acquisitions, foreign land acquisitions, goes up very sharply. When we measure, and this is, by the way, huge teams of people all over the world. These are not just my data here. When you include those, when you know those who have sold land, mostly governments, or leased land, long-term leases, and those who have bought, you get 70 million hectares bought from 2006 to 2010. If you take another measure, all those governments who have sold land, well, we don't necessarily can match them with buyers, we get over 200 million hectares, again, and this is from 2006 to 2011. And one issue that hangs in there is hedge funds buying land. In the last 2 years, hedge funds have been major buyers of land in sub-Saharan Africa. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, they have all bought land. But there we can measure it. And by the way, this buying of land by hedge funds and financial firms is not because they're about to become farmers, clearly. You know, it is another. Now, what happens when China, and this is not to criticize China, it's just a nice concrete example that we all know that China is buying land. But mind you, Sweden is buying land, South Korea is buying land, and a lot of private firms. Now, what happens when China buys 2.8 million hectares, and these are all facts, in Zambia, and 2.8 million of hectares in Congo? To create a plantation for palm in order to make biofuels, in other words, industrial crops. Most of the land is used for industrial crops, not for food crops. So it evicts faunas, floras, whole sort of smallholder agriculture sectors, little farmers, villages, and of course, rural manufacturing setups. Where do those people go? They go to cities. So we have a massive growth of slums, what we call slums, and that is a whole other kind of labor market. Now, most people in slums work very hard. It's not like our hyper ghettos where people are sort of waiting to be called back in by the system. But that is a world of work, often a very productive type of work, that simply goes uncounted. There are labor markets inside of those slums. There are intermediaries like agents or, the hiring hall. There is a whole world of labor markets. Now, part of this process, of course, feeds into the urbanization, etc., and there is a very significant urbanizing of people that is a consequence of some of these other trends. So for me, when I think jobs, I'm ending. When I think labor markets, it is one element in a larger assemblage, and how that larger assemblage is constituted makes a lot of difference. So in that Keynesian period in the United States, the question of jobs, the question of work, was an instrument for social cohesion. Today, it is much more difficult because it comes with a lot of negative trends. Thank you very much.
I just thought I would ask a question. Being a Wall Streeter, and
Yes.
you mentioned that the hedge funds investing in land.
Yes.
Is there indications that actually those land grabs are creating interesting social cohesion? Are they creating jobs? Are they creating jobs in the city? Are they creating jobs out in the rural areas?
Look, it varies enormously depending on what it is. If it's a industrial crop, that you use the land for industrial crop, you have evicted a lot of people. Now, there might be an indirect cohesion effect, because those people go to cities, they create slums, So, but that is not, I think, what we have in mind in a way, perhaps, when we speak about jobs and social cohesion. I would say we need to expand the meaning, but still, it is not totally desirable, let's put it that way. And of course, when the financial firms buy land, they sort of keep it unworked. It's a liquid investment,
So
and
that's
they sell it.
So to some extent, when you're saying when you see foreign direct investment flows, they don't necessarily have the job creation or the social cohesion that
exactly.
you
When
would think.
China buys that land, it brings in its own workers, builds its own hospitals because the workers cannot handle the weather. That creates jobs, but it's not necessary. That is what I mean. When you count jobs, there is a larger assemblage of elements that really remarks the condition.
Ragui, you're up.
Thank you very much. Well, my mandate is to look at the jobs and living standards aspect of the report. But before I start, I really have to say that I think this report was a tour de force, and I really have to compliment the authors. I've seen it at different stages. I was part of the discussion probably a year ago in Berlin, where they were just presenting some of their ideas, and then saw it again in January when they had a draft, and now, and this is tremendous richness that was added at every step, I think is extremely impressive. And just the fact that this report is able to draw on the vast resources at the World Bank and getting all these country experiences, I think makes it an extremely valuable resource for all of us who teach this stuff and who actually also advise governments, etc. So I commend the World Bank team for doing that. So, and I was given pretty much sometimes the most obvious task is kind of to talk about the link of jobs to living standards, which many of us think of it as an obvious link. However, when we think about the movements in and out of poverty, I think an interesting issue is do jobs or the gain of jobs or the loss of jobs necessarily have to lead to people moving in and out of poverty? And we saw from the data, in fact, that link between job-related events and poverty was very strong for poor countries and significantly weaker for the richer countries. And that is because they got safety nets that basically are trying to protect people from falling into poverty when something happens on the job front. However, so if we have, think about household-specific shocks that households would get, households are often one sickness and one death away from moving into poverty if there aren't those safety nets. And so that just gives you the sense that the safety nets are very important to ensure against very specific shocks, demographic shocks to the household, as well as community-wide shocks that affect the demand for labor or the productivity of labor in a community. But the ability to supply labor is not a constant over the life course of households. And I think this is where those safety nets become important. So that, in fact, development is when the link between jobs and poverty gets weaker as safety nets kick in to help people from falling into poverty. But for getting out of poverty is clearly something that is often very much related to jobs. And the report shows, in fact, I think the contrast between Asia and Africa is a very interesting one. In Asia, it takes a structural transformation, as we talked about earlier today, where a lot of the jobs that got people out of poverty were in the non-farm sector, where they were able to move and do something else. Whereas in Africa, Uganda being a good example of that, a lot of the poverty alleviation that was seen was the result of people getting more productive jobs right where they were in agriculture. So actually getting that movement out, changing jobs is not a necessary condition. Now, I'm actually more interested in kind of focusing on the non-earnings aspect of living standards and the fact that this is something that I think this is somewhat unique about this report was really to look at the aspects of living standards that people value that are related to jobs. And stability of employment or earnings, the kind of the security dimension is one. Now, that clearly goes with the insurance dimension, and there is a bit of a thinking of a trade-off. If I have good safety nets and a lot of insurance and social protection, I don't need as stable to insist of having job security. So job security, and I'll come back and talking about that trade-off that the report brings out very nicely. But people do value these things. They also value having a safe environment to work, workplace health and safety, and health insurance that would allow them to deal with sickness and injury issues. Voice and representation being also something that's highly valued, and the report highlights that. And then also doing interesting work that is not routine. And now the evidence that the report brings on that the extent to which people value this is of two ways. One is the more direct evidence, asking people how much of your earnings would be willing to sacrifice to get this health insurance or old age pension. And of course, some people might think of this as being a little bit suspect, it's subjective, but they use another methodology, which is looking at people who express different satisfactions with the job and linking those levels of satisfaction with aspects of the job, kind of a hedonic function, which I thought was an interesting methodology. I mean, this is something that I have struggled with, and you can imagine, you can see Egypt here, a country I've done a lot of research, as really valuing health insurance and old age pension, same as Sierra Leone, China less so. So in my work, I had tried to kind of specify if we wanted to do job quality at the level of a job. Often the ILO work on decent work is at the level of the economy as a whole. What would you bring in? What are the factors that you would try to bring in a sort of job quality index? And so, these are some of the ones that we were able to bring in this experiment on creating a job quality index for Egypt. Some of them have to do with insurance aspects, social insurance, health insurance, job security, so the stability of job is another very important one, kind of whether you have a contract or not, and whether the contract is definite duration or indefinite. Type of workplace, trying to get at the safety issues, concern about workplace safety. And then two that are less important, kind of the number of hours, either overemployment or underemployment, and the commuting time. Now, we didn't have a very good way of weighting these various factors, so we use kind of an empirically way of doing factor analysis. There are probably better ways of doing it, and I think the report suggests some better ways. But what I was interested in, how does job quality change over time? So we actually went and predicted the job quality in the first job for people who were entered the labor market at different times, broken down by males and females, and high education and low education. Now, what's interesting, if you think of 0 as the average job quality over the period, clearly more educated people have above average jobs, or had above average jobs early on, less educated people below average, and the gender difference is much more pronounced in terms of quality of job for less educated than for more educated. But what's interesting here is what's happening to first-time job entrants in terms of the quality of jobs they're getting among the educated. A huge decline over time. I mean, partly that is the result of essentially there are more of them, and so they're competing over fewer jobs, but it's primarily because of informalization. So over this period, essentially, you're getting the educated used to get government jobs early on. They're getting fewer and fewer of the government jobs, but there's no private sector formal employment, and so they get informalized, and the job quality declines over time. So even if we don't agree on the definition of job quality, if you look at earnings, you wouldn't get exactly that same picture. You're basically here looking at this issue of job security and social protection. Now, the report does a really excellent job looking at this issue of protecting jobs versus protecting workers. Now, and here's what it concludes. It basically says that in normal times, protecting workers is better than protecting jobs from a policy perspective. Providing the social insurance aspect is much better than doing job. But however, it does say that there is a wide plateau. So long as you are within this plateau, doing job protection, if you don't fall off the cliffs, doesn't have very strong efficiency consequences. However, I'd like to quibble a little bit because some of the evidence they show does show that it does have consequences on job turnover and on the rate at which the dynamism of the job market, the rate at which job gets destroyed and created. And they do argue in other parts of the report that creative destruction is very important. So that if job protection reduces creative destruction, then eventually it might have efficiency consequences. But in a sense that if one thinks of both of these issues, insurance and job protection, both providing security, you want to earn more on the insurance side in normal times. However, the report does argue that when you have systemic crises, where there is a decoupling between job creation and job destruction, and there's a lot of job destruction taking place at a certain given point in time and very little job creation, then there may be an argument for job protection during those periods of crisis. So temporary job protection during periods of crisis may be a good idea. Warning, however, that if you cannot make it temporary, you don't have the institution capacity to make it temporary, don't do it. Now, I'm looking at the MENA data, and there one sees a huge emphasis on job protection. And in fact, we thought initially that it was policy-driven, public sector employment, job protection through legislation and regulation. And actually, as I watch what's happening in MENA as a result of the crisis after the Arab Spring, I'm actually convinced that it's actually driven more by social norms than it is by legislation. We see very little, during this deep crisis, very little job destruction among firms that hire workers. Okay, there's a lot of churning among very small firms. But firms that hire workers, even if they're hiring workers informally, are retaining those workers. They're trying to use other mechanisms like on the earnings side to maintain those workers. And because there's a huge social stigma about letting your workers go. Employers get a terrible reputation in the community when they do that. So incumbents are protected, and it's not just the question of policy. Now, that works very well in a time of severe crisis like now. There is a lot less social pain than there would be otherwise. However, these sorts of both social norms as well as regulatory arrangements to protect jobs are long-term, and they go well beyond the time of the crisis. And what I would argue is that they have high costs. And the high costs is, first, the new entrants suffer, because those knocking at the door for these employers, now the employers know that if they let somebody in, they pretty much are responsible for them. They're not going to let them out so easily, so they're very reluctant about hiring new workers. There's a lot dampening of labor demand in a rapidly growing young population. And then also there isn't this issue of creative destruction, that there is very little job loss due to creative destruction. So I think this issue of protecting jobs is also about what happens to firms. There's also very little dynamism in terms of firms dying, especially beyond a certain size, other than the micro-enterprise size. And so firm exit also becomes an issue. And what does that do to creative? So these issues of protecting jobs versus protecting workers, I think in most of these countries there's still way too little insurance and way too much job protection. And we need to err on the side of doing more of the insurance functions to make job loss less painful, and, both socially and individually. Thank you.
Ragui, that last comment about job protection, I thought it was interesting. In your studies, have you found that there's stronger support for job protection? Is it GDP linked, or is it really more country or culturally linked? I mean, can you have countries that have exactly the same GDP per capita, and yet actually they have very different views on the question of protection of jobs versus workers?
No, I didn't see it to be GDP linked. I think the issue, well, first of all, a lot of the countries in the Middle East, for instance, come from a tradition of large public sector share of employment. So there is a sense of this premium on stability of public sector jobs. And as you move away from that, there is a sense that the private sector needs to also have. So it's really issue about protecting incumbents, insiders who already are in the system. And often that comes at the cost of the outsiders. So it's an insider-outsider model in some sense. But my surprise is that it goes beyond formal sector, and it goes well into the informal employment as well.
Interesting. Saul, you're up.
Thanks. Okay, well, I think we've each been assigned tasks somewhat implicitly. My task is focusing on the entrepreneurship side of the report. Entrepreneurship doesn't fit perfectly the whole jobs notion, because while entrepreneurship is, of course, an occupational choice and therefore is a form of employment, it's also the case that what entrepreneurs create is firms, and those firms may also additionally create jobs for others. And of course, if the firms involved fail, then the entrepreneurs lose their jobs and the people they employ lose their jobs. So they're sort of at the interface between the enterprise and the individual. And so they don't entirely fit perfectly into this particular framework. Too many people have said what I would have in my notes said next, which is that the report itself was a fascinating read and was a very welcome document in many ways that have already been discussed. I think for me, one of the most important contributions has been the various different methodologies, as was noted earlier, and the amount of data and information that's contained within it. Now, I'm going to focus my remarks on three areas. The first thing I'm going to do is try and work out from this particular chapter that I'm referring to, Chapter 3 on jobs and productivity, what I thought, from my perspective, was the most important lesson from the report. So I'm going to actually spend a little bit of my time on exactly on what the report says, but putting it together slightly differently. I'm then going to go to areas where I think the report could have refined things more and therefore could have got further. And then finally, I'm going to mention a couple of places, if I have time, that were omitted from the report that I wouldn't, if I had been writing it, have omitted. So, beginning at the beginning, I think since the work of Haltivanger and others, we've understood that the role of job creation and job destruction is crucial, and that is very important in the context of the process and creation and destruction of firms as well. So entry and exit of firms is a key part of job creation and job destruction. And this is what's driving both productivity growth and economic growth. And then from that, there's a quote that I put up here from sort of embedded right in the middle of Chapter 3, which I think captures what Chapter 3 is trying to do, which says the wide dispersion of productivity amongst businesses, the large number of unsustainable micro-enterprises, and the stagnation of larger firms all suggest that the process of market selection and creative destruction that has underpinned rapid growth in developed countries is weak in developing countries. And it seems to me that that's the central message, that if you put all the data together in that chapter, that is being said, that these processes are weak. And from that, we can pull out some policy conclusions. For the situation to improve, we need to see much more firm entry, we need existing firms to create new jobs, and we need much greater competitive processes impacting upon existing firms. And I think that's the message, if you want, of this chapter. And without going into too much detail, if people want to check this, I think you'll see sort of data brought to bear. Figure 3.7, which I haven't reproduced, but people can quickly look up, gives the employment share of micro-enterprises running as high as 94% in some countries. It shows that the process of creation and destruction of jobs, interestingly, is concentrated in micro firms. The evidence is a little bit thin on this, but it is an extremely interesting finding. It shows, and this is perhaps apposite to my main point, that the dispersion of productivity, which we already know from the work of Bloom and Van Reen and others, is extremely wide in developed countries, is even wider in developing countries. And so, and the survival of the weakest, and I'll come back to this, is a key reason why productivity growth is so slow. And lastly, and this has been referred to this morning, it shows that entry rates of new firms. It's not true that firms aren't being created and jobs aren't being created. What is true is you have a lot of entry and a lot of exit. Churning is very high. Now, churning is also very high in developed countries, right? But it's even higher in developing ones. So they're, to me, what came out of the reporters on productivity and on this creative destruction process. What areas would have I sharpened in the discussion? Well, 3 of them. I think I would have talked a little bit more about institutions, right? I would have thought about the informal sector a bit differently, and I would have distinguished sharply between firm creation and between firm scalability. That's the process of growth of firms. And they're the 3 things I want to spend a little bit of time on. So, just to remind you of sort of William Baumol in 1990 put forward the view that the supply of entrepreneurship, if you can define such a thing, is probably very similar in developed and in developing countries. But the incentive systems motivates potential entrepreneurs either to go down a route of being productive in their activity, or being non-productive in their activity, or being destructive in their activity. And those incentive systems are related to the underlying institutional arrangements. And it seems to me a priori, if you consider, for example, the role of the drugs trade and drugs barons in parts of Latin America, or of mafia activities in the Balkans and the former Soviet Union, it's very hard to disagree with this Baumol analysis of what's going on in emerging markets and how entrepreneurship is not always going in productive directions. Now, there has been some work done on this, unfortunately some of it by me, so I'm going to talk about my own, although there's plenty of alternatives. We do know something about what institutions are conducive to entrepreneurship. The key things that come out, I think, is that entrepreneurship needs protection of property rights, it needs the rule of law, and it needs, and this does relate to some of the discussion we were just hearing, it needs a relatively smaller scale of the state sector. It needs sharp, both on the social sector side and on the taxation side. So that, I think that's an important, the institutional element is important. If we distinguish between entrepreneurs that create jobs from entrepreneurs that just create jobs for themselves, self-employment and high-growth employment, what comes out of the work that's looked at institutions on that, of course, property rights and so forth and incentives are very important for all entrepreneurs. Interestingly, corruption doesn't much affect entrepreneurship as a whole, but it's very important in a destructive way in preventing the growth of firms. And so I would have expected perhaps a little bit more on that. The second thing to say is that social capital, in particular social networks amongst entrepreneurs, which is an important policy area that could be developed, the Chinese have done an enormous amount on this, militates against weak institutions for high-growth entrepreneurship. My second comment is on the informal sector. And we have had discussion of this morning, so I can speed up. It seems to me that what we haven't talked about enough in the report is the relationship between the informal sector and the dispersion of productivity that we observe, and the relationship between the formal and the informal sector. They're the 2 things that I think are underdeveloped. And let me talk a little bit about both of these. If you look at the interaction between the formal and the informal sector, because workers in the informal sector, of course, are not paying taxes, are not paying social security, are not being subject to various sorts of rules and regulations, informal firms are able to offer incomes that are below workers in the formal sector, and therefore they can employ and produce people at lower levels of productivity, but they can the firms and the organizations can still survive because they're still able to pay their workers the supply price. So if we're looking at a higher heterogeneity of productivity in developing countries, it's likely because of the relationship, in part because of the relationship between the formal and the informal sector. And I think there's quite a lot of the corollaries for policy that comes out of that. The second point, which is comes from my own work, which I think is quite interesting, is that actually the size of the informal sector has been found to mitigate against all entrepreneurship, that is, entrepreneurship in both the formal and the informal sector. In some work that I did coming out in the review of development economics, what we've shown is that as the informal sector becomes larger as a share of GDP, rates of entrepreneurship, both formal and informal combined, decline. And I have a graph that summarizes this. It's actually a U-shaped relationship. So on the x-axis, what we've got is the size of the informal sector normalized for GDP, and on the y-axis, what we have is the entrepreneurship rate. And what you'll see is that particularly at relatively low to rising levels of the size of the informal sector, there's a negative effect, quite sharp negative effect, on actually how much entrepreneurship is done. And we argue essentially that this is because it's a dual labour market when you have a formal and informal sector. And what you're actually doing is increasing the barriers to entry in both sectors simultaneously by segmenting them. When the economy is almost entirely either formal or almost entirely either informal, what we then find is entrepreneurship rates are higher. Okay, my third area of comment is on new firm creation and scalability. I want to comment on that because one of the very interesting questions, it was a really excellent little section that people might want to read. Martin referred to questions, and in this chapter there's a question which is essentially, can you teach entrepreneurship? It's slightly more sophisticated than that. Very good question. And it does seem to me that if you want to understand what's needed for education of entrepreneurship, you need to understand more about what being an entrepreneur entails, especially in developing countries. And the standard framework on management skills for entrepreneurship builds on Sassen's work in 82, and there's a reference to Shane and Venkataraman that more or less defines this. What this does is distinguish between the individual characteristics of entrepreneurs and the opportunities of entrepreneurs. Now, the report tends to focus almost entirely on the former, that is, characteristics and what can you train, and you do tend to be a bit pessimistic if you're looking at characteristics as to what education can do. If you're, however, looking at opportunities and the interaction between characteristics and opportunities, I think one can be much more optimistic. Now, the nature of opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities in developing countries are very different to the nature of opportunities in developed countries. They're not so much Schumpeterian. The report refers to gazelles, but it seems, which is the great, the guy that invents Microsoft in a garage. This is not really, I think, the way entrepreneurship and innovation works in developing countries. It's much more better conceived of as an adaptation of existing processes and products to entirely new environments, a more Kurtznerian view of bricolage. And that implies that the interface between opportunities and characteristics will be very different to in Western economies, and therefore the training in terms of discovering the skills, the key skill will be opportunity recognition and understanding the nature of the opportunities. I also would just like to mention that one of the big issues, as was Martin said this morning, in developing countries, is that when firms are created, they tend to not grow. This applies just as much to firms that are created as self-employment or one or two employees, or actually to medium to large firms. And there is, the issue here is one of scalability. And there is, again, a literature on scalability and the skills required to scalability. The key point is that scalability is about a standardization of process, a replicability of processes and of structures, and an adaptation of incentives to areas to fit this replicability. So there's a whole literature on this which I think would have been very helpful in thinking about educating entrepreneurs. Well, let me end with 2 points on emissions. Some of them have been picked up already. One, I think, is I would have expected to see more on female entrepreneurship, given that female entrepreneurship seems to me an important way of achieving social as well as economic goals. There's been a lot of work on this area, and it was implicit but not sufficiently explicit in the report. The thing that I did look for and couldn't find, and I found very odd given the focus of the report, was about there's now a lot of entrepreneurship going on in which the motivation of the entrepreneur is not profitability, but is instead to achieve social goals. Now, this seems to me very interesting in this context, because this form of activity is something that simultaneously creates jobs, alleviates social problems such as poverty, and creates social cohesion. And social firms, however, in order to survive, also need to develop commercial skills, and they can create jobs. So it did seem to me this was something that we are seeing, for example, especially in places like India and Bangladesh, a lot of, and it might seem to be a way of encapsulating some of the themes. I think I've probably done enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Saul, it was interesting what you were talking about. Maybe I've just been watching too much Mitt Romney lately. But the question about entrepreneurship, we take it as almost a granted, like it's always a good thing. But you actually raise, in the report raises this question about the dispersion of productivity, how it actually might exacerbate it. And the question is, are there bad, good, better, best versions of entrepreneurship? It's not all good, is it? I mean, the social cohesion question comes up because you could make an argument that some of the more entrepreneurial countries also have seen deterioration in their Gini coefficients, right? Places like China, for example, you've seen a fairly steep decline there.
Yes, I think there's... I don't know whether this is working. There are 2 points there. I'll bring this up. This really is the Baumol point. How do I... No, put it closer. Is that how I do it? Yeah? Baumol's point is that, which there's a lot being developed, that if you look at a place, I mean, let's take Russia as an example. It's not that Russia is much less entrepreneurial, but the way things were, institutions were arranged and incentives were created in the late 1980s, 1990s, the people who were of very strong entrepreneurial skills were not driven to go out and create companies and create jobs and innovate, but were instead driven either to seek rents or to essentially go into crime. And that's, well, I was going to say it's not their fault. It is, of course, they're making moral choices, but it's to do with the underlying incentives that the economy creates in which direction entrepreneurship goes, and that's what I've been trying to illustrate.
Excellent. Bentley, you want to finish up?
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It's sort of intimidating to talk to such an erudite audience about the issue of economic development. In a sense, I think this report is sort of mind-bogglingly complex. It's sort of trying to solve all the world's problems in a few hundred pages and provide sort of a rich tapestry of human experience across the planet. In some sense, it sort of reminds me of when I go to the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. I think, and I advise any of you who are out of town to go to the Met. You walk through and you're just simply amazed by the things that human beings have produced over several thousand years of our history. And you sort of, they give you sort of inspiration of where we're going forward. And I think in some sense this report is attempting to ask the question, where is humanity moving forward and how can we sort of improve humanity through the sort of work experience? Now what I'm going to talk about, now I talked to Martin this morning briefly. I'm a labor/contract theorist. I am sort of labor economics at Columbia at the moment. I'm teaching the graduate labor course in the economics department. And Martin mentioned to me that he felt that labor economists were not always welcoming of his job's perspective. I'm here to say, no, that's not true. We like that. What we do, though, is we're very simple-minded. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about is simple ideas, because when you look at this rich tapestry of experiences, it's very difficult to make a decision, is what should I do next? And we've seen from our colleagues here, each person has sort of all these complicated possibilities, and as we look across country, one country does it one way and other countries do it the other way. So what I'm going to try to do is simplify the idea a little bit, and as a sort of sum up what I mean by a job, and what are sort of some essential features of the job process. Now, does this work? Yes. So I'm going to do, it's in 3 parts. Concept of the job, commodification of work. I'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about jobs in the law, and the law is going to play an important role. Talk about modern times. Modern times. So I also advise you to look at this movie. It's a great representation of the modern worker in the United States. And I think one of the features of this report, it relies a lot about work in developing economies, but I think the U.S. went through a complicated development process as well, and I think we learned a lot from Charlie Chaplin and his cohort as well, and I'll come back to some other experiences there. So the first thing to point out, and I think I'm going to have a couple of bottom lines, but my first bottom line, there's a little discussion of innovation and the fact that we need more capital, more ideas. And I think one thing that's not well appreciated is the creation of a job, the creation of a compensation system. Figuring out how to reward and motivate individuals is hard. That is part of the technology of production. So production technology is not simply a machine or something. It's also the social fabric of how we get people to work together. And in a sense, when we introduce the notion of a job, what we're trying to do here is commodify labor. We're trying to say that I can take labor and I can put it on a market and I can price it. Now, we have this sort of general feeling that commodification, in fact, there's a good book by Douglas Allen who talks about commodification over several hundred years in human history. Commodification is a way we bring things from the family, from the tribe, to the market, and in doing so, we hope to improve the allocation of resources. Okay? It's a hard process. It's a continuous process, and even today, we have lots of examples of increased commodification, like the internet, Facebook. These are new commodities that are being created, and people are trying to figure out, well, how do I make money off Facebook, for example, is an important question. The problem they're asking is, how do I commodify something like Facebook and make it a business? It's an ongoing process. It's hard. Okay? And I think one thing that I think would be helpful is to have a little bit more appreciation of how hard this problem is of creating a job, of taking this worker and motivating them and making sure that they're productive. Now, what the report does, I think, is in some sense brings development that comes into modern times. I think the notion of a job is now central to what we do in labor economics. Okay? The traditional economic notion of work, the commodities defined in terms of labor, hours, and wages, these are ideas that go back to work in the National Statistical Institutions, the U.S. and France, 19th century. That is, as economists, when we talk about wages and hours, it's not because that's the correct model. It's clearly a false model, but it's a very useful way of summarizing a lot of problems that occur in economies. It's not true. Unfortunately, sometimes some of our colleagues view it as truth, and then we get certain policy recommendations, like we must abandon the minimum wage or get rid of certain friction, in the hope that those things will actually generate better outcomes. But that doesn't always work, and the reason is it's only a model. It's not always true. What I'm going to talk a little bit is more about the sort of modern notion of what I mean by a job. Let's point out one thing. In practice, but not in theory, commodification leads to more growth. So Schleifer has a nice thing called the Age of Milton Friedman. He argues when we look across countries around the world, free markets have made things better off, i.e. commodification is good. Now, I should point out that's an empirical statement, not a theoretical statement. I teach microtheory. There's no theorem that says adding more markets will necessarily make you better off, and certainly people will look at the recent financial crisis as an example of that idea. One issue is since not all work is measured, such as household production, unpriced agrarian work. So for an economist, output is every bit of work. That includes things that are not priced, includes household work, it means the work that women do raising kids. That's all economic activity. But since it's not priced and we don't see it, policymakers may treat it differently than things that we can actually measure and see. So one of the important issues when you create a job is you want to create these categories. Those categories will affect the way policymakers actually choose various policies and intervene in the marketplace, and will affect ultimately inequality among different groups of individuals. Okay? So in people that I can measure, i.e. jobs, I will treat them differently than, for example, my local mafioso chief who's working on a slightly different illegal market. Okay? The other thing I want to point out briefly, and I'm just going to give you a quick example. Unemployment is hard to solve because unemployment, for example, is a social construct. So unemployment is not something that is true or not true. It is a socially constructed category of individuals who answer a question and say, I cannot find work, or I'm looking for work. Those individuals who are unemployed are alive, they're doing something, and depending on the country they're in, they'll be involved in different types of activities. One example I really love is an anecdote, but when I go to Spain, I noticed, I lived in Spain for a year, whenever my car was robbed in Spain, it was a brilliant job. Very little damage. Spain has 20% unemployment. to me, what that said is unemployed workers in Spain are very highly skilled. They're really good crooks. I mean, and that's just an example of a misallocation of resources, because that individual was able to get into my car in literally 15 seconds and remove the radio. That is a highly skilled person, could be more productively employed somewhere else than in the streets of Barcelona. Okay? So when I see that, I just see, well, there's a missed opportunity. So Spain, is facing hard problems now. Let me give you an example. I want to give you an example of work I've done. I know the stuff I've done better than most other things, but this is an important example. It was an example in Canada, because here I want to give you an example. Canada, I'm a Canadian, it's a nice place. And in 1971, they said, we should be nicer to workers. And so what they did is they dramatically improved the unemployment insurance system, something that nice people would like to do. Moreover, in the Canadian Parliament, they actually said, people said, well, maybe these workers won't work so hard. Oh, no, these are Canadian workers. They want to work hard. They're really dedicated. So we did the experiment. Now, what's interesting is people did behave as predicted by economic theory. That is, they worked a little bit less harder. But the interesting thing is how long it took for people to adjust. And I've got 2 points here. The first point is 2 very well-known economists, Card and Riddell, looked at the changes in unemployment over time in Canada. And there's a puzzle, because the unemployment rate in Canada seems to be going higher than in the US, yet the benefits seem to be decreasing. Because what happened in 1971, the government immediately realized they made a mistake, and they tried to fix the mistake. So while they were fixing the mistake, unemployment kept ratcheting up. And so Card and Riddell said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Benefits are getting worse, unemployment is going up. What's going on? Well, we looked at this, and what we found is that there's a learning effect. That essentially, it's true that in the short run, workers, if they've got a job, they're not going to go on unemployment. But over time, as they discovered the benefits of the unemployment system, they actually adopted their behavior. So the reason that's important is what we found is that it took 20 years for this adoption to occur. So what does that imply? That's a real result, which suggests it's a behavioral result. That when we change incentives in an economy, it can take many years for those to work out. Moreover, the type of techniques we use to identify those impacts are basically not going to work. So as a labor economist, we tend to use techniques that can identify the impact of a policy over a month or over a year. We really don't have very good economic techniques for identifying the impact of a policy change over 20 years. Now, we were lucky here. We had data then that we cannot have now, which is basically the tax records of every Canadian in Canada for a 20-year period. But it's just, that's a hard problem. There's no real solution for that. So, and you do allude to the fact you have a lot of time trends, but getting a causal relationship between the policy impact and its effect on dynamics is a very, very hard problem. Hard problem. So lesson 1, so individuals do not necessarily think in terms of jobs, but think in terms of revenue stream from work, which includes formal jobs, government income, informal work, and so on. Should these be commodified as well? So one question is, where do we commodify things? Should the notion of jobs be expanded or retracted? Second point, really important. I lived in West Africa for a while, and one of the things that struck me living in Africa, people are creative and hardworking. Very creative. So when we talk about innovation, it's not just, they're always creative, always trying to figure out how to survive. And so part of the job as economists is to create an environment where that creativity is productive. That's a hard problem. Okay? Let me skip, I'm running short of time. Let me talk quick, 2 more points. The law. The law is an important element here. The law is old. The law has been trying to deal with humanity and getting people to work together for thousands of years. And in fact, this is great. Oliver Wendell Holmes is fantastic. The law embodies the story of a nation's development. Through many centuries, it cannot be dealt with as if it contained only the axioms corollary of a book of mathematics. Oh, that's for the economist. In order to know what it is and to know what it has been and what it tends to become. Now, of course, when he says hundreds of years, that suggests that many developing countries, which have legal histories that are much shorter, will not have the benefit of this sort of long common law history. And one of the things I want to point out is when we talk about a job, one of the ways to think about the job is defined by the law. When I get a job, it's in some sense a legal definition. I now have a set of obligations, and every country in the world has an off-the-shelf set of obligations for the employer and the employee when they enter into a job. And one of the things, you talked about labor law, but you didn't talk much about the heterogeneity in labor law across all these different countries. And therefore, we would expect that depending on what that local law is going to be, you're going to have different types of behaviors within. And let me just give you an example of some laws. And this is actually quite important. Hammurabi's Code, first minimum wage law, 1750 BC. Okay? Now, the reason I give that is a good example. We often attack minimum wages, but you have to ask yourself the following question. If we've had minimum wage laws for over 3,000 years, there's got to be something good about it, right? Okay? Then there's the racial discrimination. I won't talk about that. I'll talk about the good faith exception and applied contract exception. These are interesting. These are U.S. laws. Okay? 1977, 1985. What did these laws say? These laws said that if you're an employer, you should not lie to employees. Now, you'd think employers do not lie. But in fact, they would enter into contracts. They would tell informally their employees one thing and then do something else. That was termed illegal. Now, that seems really sensible. Yet most of the time when people attack employment law, they think it adds all these rigidities. But some of the element, and probably the most important element of the law, is to get people to operate in a fair and correct fashion. And lying to employees is probably something you wouldn't want your employees to do. I'm out of time, right? I'll give you one result. I have a paper with a former student of ours in which we show that bringing in employment law of that type actually improved employment for highly skilled individuals. Now, 1 minute. So lesson 2, I haven't time for that. Just let me get my last point. I don't know if you saw the movie. It's a great bit. Increasing job efficiency. So there's a scene in modern times where Charlie Chaplin is asked to sit down so we can find a way to make the worker more productive so that they can eat and work at the same time. Interesting idea. And it's great to see him as he sits there, get his teeth brushed. You see the food there? Wonderful. I just want to point out something. This is like super important. It's not so much, there's a whole bunch of work done. We've been trying to find the silver bullet to have effective jobs for a long time. There's the work Taylor is well known from 1911, has been trying to, made the simple observation. He looked at factories and said, look, here's a factory. Those workers would like to work harder, but you have to pay them more. And the firm would be happy to pay them more to make them work harder, but somehow they can't figure out how to do that. He tried to figure out how to do it, didn't work, and the problem they face, as Stephen Kerr pointed out later, people are smart. You try to bring in some system, and they immediately start gaming the system. So it turns out that to have a job and to figure out a compensation system that gets those workers to work well is really hard, and you've got smart employees trying to constantly, fiddle with the job. Let me just point out, but let me give you another table. This is a table, and here what we're trying to show, so what I've said is that compensation reform is important. Can I prove that? Well, here's a paper that I did with Thomas Lemieux and Dan Perron on the QJE, and what we plot here is basically differences in wages as a function of performance pay instance. So what we show in the U.S. economy, particularly in the later 1990 to 1993 period, there's been an increased use in performance pay. That's resulted in increased inequality, particularly at the higher end. It's also resulted, as it turns out, lower turnover. And I get the point there. I can go on for too long, and I have to stop. I realize that. But I think it provides an example illustrating that performance pay, or the design of compensation, does affect economic outcomes. And that's something that's not too much discussed in the report. It could. I'll give you the last lesson 3. Employment's hard. Our newest fad policy is to have subordinates appraise their boss's job performance. I give you D-. Did I mention retribution? Careful, sir, you're hanging by a thread. So employment, I have some stuff that paper discusses, but employment involves a give and take between two individuals, and basically some environments, the boss and the worker get along fine. In Dilbert, there's a long litany of examples where things don't work well. Okay, so I guess I better stop there. And I'll leave you my last summary. Okay, thank you very much.
We got to a little bit of a late start. We have about 15, 20 minutes for some questions.
I'd like to raise a question, and it's semi-facetious, but I think it's nevertheless a real problem, which is that not all the unemployed are necessarily unemployed. And by this I mean, take the underground economy, and certainly in a number of developing countries, the underground economy, if you could actually estimate the contribution to GDP, it would be a fairly significant number. It could be 30, 40, 50%. But even in developed countries, and I know the situation has changed rather drastically, but I still remember in the Netherlands in the 1970s, early 1980s, something like 1 million of the labor force, productive labor force, had been declared unfit for work. Basically, you had to go see a doctor, you had a bad back, and you got a certificate, and you could get something like 70, 80% of the wages that you would have gotten given your qualifications. Well, what this led to was a situation where I would say the great majority of these so-called unemployed did work. When you needed a plumber, when you needed a contractor, you would call people, and the first question that they would ask you is this going to be black or white?
They pay
If
cash.
it was black, no, you wouldn't get any bill, you wouldn't have to pay any Social Security charges or what have you. Black meant it was absolutely under the table. Black was usually something like 50% of white in terms of the cost. Now, the point that I'm trying to make, and as I say, it's semi-facetious, is that sometimes we get caught with classifications that are not really descriptive of a situation. And I think we ought not to forget that an unemployed can, in fact, be employed.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think that you said it all, basically. And what I like is that I'm Dutch, and I know a lot about this, that you brought up also a highly developed country, because we tend to think that only happens in the... But I think that the bigger point that I hear in what you are saying is, and I think it came out in all our discussions, is that a job, a task, a labor market, these are very ambiguous terms, and they need empirical specification, and aggregate data often misses a lot. And I think the report does make a contribution in showing the variables. They maybe don't use that language, but it can be many, many different things.
Eric, I think the problem you mentioned is worse, of course, when you link a payment to being unemployed. Now, in most countries, there is no such payment. But the incentives to distort your situation is different. For instance, if you think that if you say that you're unemployed in a government survey, you might get a government job. So in this case, it biases who actually says they're unemployed. So in a place like the Middle East, unemployed are mostly educated, fairly privileged people, because they have an incentive to want a formal job, and so there is an incentive to look for a formal job, and even if they are working on the side, they don't consider that to be proper work. However, the poor have no such hope, and they have no incentive to say they're unemployed. Now, the other problem is who's unemployed versus out of the labor force. Poor women who don't work are out of the labor force because they have no hope of getting a formal job. Whereas poor women who are not working, who might still want to get a government job, are unemployed. Sorry, rich women or more educated women who are not working would declare themselves to be unemployed. And so again, the point between the barrier, the border between unemployment and out of the labor force is also just as...
Bentley, you want to...
Yeah, just... well, first thing, I think the report actually is quite sensitive to that point. In some sense, I think in many places they say that jobs are very complicated, it's very hard to define. So I think that's sort of, basically almost explicit in your work. So I think they've done a good job. It is a very hard problem. I just have a graph here. I just wanted to show you that Miguel may talk about education tomorrow, but I think it's just to give you an example of some of the issues we're dealing with. Here, I simply have fraction of population not in labor force as a function of educational attainment. I don't think I've ever seen this picture anywhere else. And what you see is that in the U.S., it looks, which I could say is a well-functioning market. You could sort of see a nice yellow line, is that basically people with no schooling, some of these people will be disabled or various other problems, that basically out of the labor force is very high, and then as educational attainment goes up, basically labor force participation goes up in a very smooth fashion. But you look at Tanzania and Ghana, you don't have that pattern at all, which essentially suggests that there's a potential mismatch that people who are getting high educations, a PhD or a college degree, have now an expectation of a job which is socially constructed to be like the United States. So they look at the U.S. say, well, if I get a job, it'll be like in the U.S., then I'll basically have a good life and so forth. And clearly, the data, that's not happening. Now, those people, as you point out, are not necessarily starving. They're surviving somehow, so they're doing some economic activity. And we have some. You discussed some of the things that they're doing, but that I think is a serious point. And I think you're certainly well aware of that, and I'm sure you have something to say about it. In fact, Martin. So,
Martin, do you want to comment?
Okay.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz, and I want to address this question to Professor Estrin, if only because I am an LSE grad, so, and I am awakening from a very long slumber of 27 years. I did my MSc dissertation on the urban informal sector, but ever since then I haven't ever even thought about those issues. On the issue more specifically of creative destruction, and I know it's a loaded question, but why? What is so good about creative destruction, and are there hard data that proves that the more, what is the difference between churning and creative destruction? And I'm not saying that it's a different question, because there is where I want to arrive. In less developed countries, there has been said, and the report I think mentions that creative destruction doesn't work as well as in rich countries. And but to begin with, I think that they should differentiate what's going on in the U.S. and maybe in a few other countries, and what still goes in Europe. I'll call it all Europe or New Europe. I don't know. That's a different stuff. But whereas in less developed countries, there is no creative destruction, but at the same time, it's a matter of definition. But many people are destroying their lives throughout their life cycle by being forced to be out of the formal labor market. They never made it into real entrepreneurship. So what's so good about creative destruction?
So the question is, creative destruction, churning, what's so good about it?
Yeah.
And are there differences between it in developing countries versus more advanced countries?
And more specifically as well, any differences between creative destruction and just the culture of survival, which in that respect, I think in less developed countries is much more a matter of reality, because they don't lack the social network to protect them. So they are constantly destroying. They might switch from one sector to another. I mean, opening a food business seems like if it is the
Saul?
paradigm of creative destruction.
Well, it's a big topic that's been raised. I can't hope to answer it fully. I think creative destruction, the notion of creative destruction, what's so good about it is it's in some sense it's the engine room of economic growth. So let's think about 2 or 3 examples. If there is a major new innovation, which say a new product or a new process or whatever it is, in order for that to be embedded in the economy, resources have got to be shifted into that activity. And for it to be disseminated, additional companies have got to imitate those processes or develop those processes. And those have got to be moved from other activity. In the process of creative destruction, that's one element of it. A second example of creative destruction, say, between sectors, is if relative prices, relative trade possibilities alter, as happened, say, in Eastern Europe when the Eastern European countries were mainly trading with the former Soviet Union, and their whole setup was of that sort. And then what happened was that essentially they joined the world's economic system, all their relative prices changed, all their comparative advantage altered, and at that point you needed massive shifts of resources, labour and capital and firms, from one set of activities to another set of activities, and the process whereby that occurs is creative destruction. I think, I mean, so is it a good, so maybe I should mention the third thing. And then the third thing, a part of creative destruction, is, I mean, what it is about is the shift of resources from low to high value added uses. And that's the sense in which it drives economic growth. And if you're asking, is it of relevance in a developing country, it's of even more relevance in a developing country, because the opportunities, because the dispersion of productivities is greater, because the inefficiencies in the allocation of resources are greater, and therefore the need for the shift of resources is greater.
But can I add something on the people side, the employment side? I mean, the example that I gave of China buying 2.8 million hectares, etc., it destroys a vast amount of livelihoods. And so I think what systems then need to develop are ways of compensating for that extreme. You know, we can't just let them there, kill our way through it, as somebody, anyhow, I do think that that's the other side of creative destruction, wherever the question.
I think we have time for one more question.
My question has to do, I think, with the last 2 points. And the question for the team is, what's your view on the issue of credit availability? I mean, entrepreneurs need credit, job creation needs credit, job destruction needs credit, achieving higher productivity needs credit, moving from informality to formality needs credit, rural incomes, of which 50% come from non-farm jobs, need credit. So I think this is an issue that I would like to hear a little more, either from the team and the panelists, particularly in these days. I mean, during good or bad times, and perhaps the protection that several panelists mentioned about perhaps has to do with ways of providing credit in order to facilitate all these shifts and transformation.
So the question is access to finance and credit as a catalyst for all the changes that you described. Anybody want to?
Well, I'm willing to come in, but not to say anything that isn't obvious. It is a very important item, a very important element. I think the critical constraint, the two critical constraints on entrepreneurship in developing countries are low levels of literacy and numeracy amongst potential entrepreneurs, which makes the whole training thing extremely difficult, and availability of finance. So I do think it's a very important issue. And it does require, and we have seen this both, it does require the development of very, very different types of financial instruments. Because in Western economies, banks draw very heavily on economies of scale, whereas things have got to be at a very micro level. And of course, we have seen in the last 10 or 15 years the development of microfinance and et cetera, both on a commercial side and on a non-commercial side. But there is far more to be done in those areas, I think.
I'll make one statement about that. I mean, one thing that we know, I'm not really an expert in this, but what we see in Western economies, for example, in the United States, is a lot of venture capital firms, private equity firms, and I talked to one private equity person, and what they do as a business, and this guy's now working in Brazil and various countries, is they don't just give credit, but they also provide skills. So they will go into a private equity firm will buy a distressed asset and then bring in a management team to basically teach the team how to perform better. And actually this person told me that one of the toughest countries to deal with is France, for example. So, it takes them, in the US, you can turn around a company in like 4 months, but in France, it takes 2 years to get everybody on side. Now, what that does, it illustrates that it's not just credit, but it's credit plus skills. Yeah. And one of the problems you face is that this person who's very good, they're dealing with $100 million companies. Now, where are you going to find somebody who's going to who has a similar level of skill, but going to provide it at much lower levels of capitalization? And venture capitalists do exactly the same thing in Silicon Valley. So many venture capitalists are skilled in identifying good projects and then teaching the people how to manage their firm better. So finding a way to match skills with investments is a very hard problem. And and it's hard.
I guess that's also where microcredit can sort of come into play at the much lower level, below the $100 million
How
enterprises.
do they bring the skills? Who's providing the skills that goes along with
But I
microcredit?
think
think
that,
this
can I
woman
just say- oh, I'm sorry. I just think that you raise a critical question, and it's a question that is the problem of credit, and it's a variable. It's affecting a lot of firms in rich countries. It's affecting a lot of firms in underdeveloped. It's highly variable. And I think one critical variable in all, sort of intervention, if you want, is the financializing of banking capital, the destruction of the local credit function in the forms of credit unions. That's happening in rich countries, that's happening in poor countries. And so I think that this has enormous employment effects or unemployment effects.
I was told we have time for one more question. Would you like to come up?
I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Beagle. I'm a member of the WDR team. I don't have a question. I just wanted to offer clarification on our on how we're measuring jobs and employment. So where possible, the team directly went to microdata, which are basically household surveys that have been conducted by national statistical agencies to get measures of labor force participation, unemployment, and categorizing employment categories. And we basically follow the framework set out by the ILO and statistical definitions that have been established for years that adhere to systems, structure of national accounts, measures from national accounts. And so what that does include, when we talk about people who have a job, we're including people who are working regardless of whether or not it's formal sector job. If they're working on the farm, they're included. If they're working in a household enterprise with no paycheck, as what we casually call unpaid family labor, they're included. If they're working illegally, regardless of the legality of the work, it's included if it's identified in the survey. And I think based on my experience in many countries, low-income countries particularly, that people decouple the idea that it's a government survey from what they're reporting. I think they're reporting with a fair amount of honesty about what they're doing or what they're not doing with their time. When it comes to identifying unemployment, it's not a self-reported question. So we don't ask, the surveys aren't asking people, are you unemployed? Which is very problematic for a number of reasons that have been pointed out. Rather, the surveys ask, what have you been doing in the last week across a number of dimensions? And if you aren't doing any of these activities, are you seeking work? And through comparing these different answers, you identify those who are unemployed. And those who are not employed or unemployed are out of the labor force. So this figure here is very interesting. And I'm assuming it comes from, say, the Ghana Living Standards Survey or the Tanzania LFS, maybe, the labor force survey. And based on my knowledge, let's say working in Tanzania for several years, those university-educated individuals who are not in the labor force, I believe, the vast majority of them are not doing any income activity. So I don't think the issue is a reporting problem, that people are sort of hiding the work they're doing. They're actually not doing any work. And, partly that reflects the fact they come from wealthier households. So the income that they're living off of is other people's generated income, or possibly transfers.
Still pretty shocking, though.
It is pretty shocking, but this is the story, and this is also why we, very much in the onset of the report, we de-emphasize the notion of unemployment, because it is a very OECD-centric concept of looking at jobs. And so, in fact, in the report, we don't talk a lot about the notion of unemployment for that reason. Thank you.
I think it's time for a coffee break, but let's have a round of applause for the panel. Jan, when would you like everybody back here? It's supposed to be at 3:30 or 30 minutes? Back here in 30 minutes.